All right, so far what we have is a page that looks like this. We are essentially finished styling it. The one thing that it doesn't do very well, I'm going to go ahead and close the original one. The one thing it doesn't do very well is scale. So like if I were to take, it looks fine here, but if I go smaller, 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 it starts to run into itself, right? And the text just gets a little bit too big. And the other thing too is if I were to go to a much smaller screen, let's do an inspector. Let's do that. Let's go, and I'll show you how you can use, there's this little toggle tool I showed you before, but you can open something up in the inspector and then toggle to the mobile view right here. And there's some different ways that you can do this. You can either do responsive, which allows you to resize it, right? And then you can start to really see problems. The other thing that you can do is you can choose an actual phone size. And so if I go, let's just try the Pixel 2. Pixel 2, it looks not too bad, right? It's okay. But on some of the smaller screens, like if you were to go to something that's a lot smaller, like an old iPhone, 4 or something like that, even an iPhone SE, it's going to start getting messed up, right? And the margins are a little bit too big here. The lines wrap too soon and stuff. So what we can do is we can do what's referred to as a media query. And I'll show you how to write this. And it's kind of cool if you wanted to look at your work this way. You can either do it with the inspector open or not. But if you want to take this like this and just go ahead and click the plus button down here, we're going to just make a dummy rule. All right, it doesn't matter what you've got selected. And then I want you to click on Inspector Style Sheet. And what it does is it takes you over here. Let me show you exactly what it did. We were in Elements, okay, right here. But then if you click back over here to Sources, there's an Inspector Style Sheet, and it shows you your style sheets here. That's the one that we're currently working on right here. If you were to come down and take a look at all of these things, you'll see that this is the inspector style sheet, and those are the temporary styles that it allows you to write. So I'm going to just get rid of that where it says header. And I want to show you how to write something. So a media query is something where it is conditional and it works inside the CSS, and it basically looks for a minimum or a maximum width of the dimension of the screen or of the viewport, and whenever it hits that, it will kick in some new CSS. So the way that you would write that media query is at media, so it's an at symbol and then the word media, and then I'm going to say screen because it's going to be based on the screen, and I'm going to put a condition in parentheses that is going to be, in my case, I want to say that it has a maximum width. So max width, max dash width, and then colon of whatever the pixel dimension is. And I think that it's probably going to break down somewhere in the ballpark of 700 pixels px right there. And then I'd come over here, and then I have to put an opening curly brace, and this is where my new rules will go. And so what this means is that whenever it hits a maximum width of 700 pixels, then all of the other rules will be fine. Those will kick in, but anything lower than 700 pixels will get this special set of rules. Well, the things that are broken are the things that I want to put special rules for. The first one that I see right off the bat is this H1. So let's go ahead and let's make a rule for H1. So basically you see that it's a full rule inside of this media query, right? And so you're going to have multiple rules potentially inside of a media query. So for H1, let's change the font size first of all. And the first thing that I'm going to suggest is that right now it's 4M. Well, we could do something like 2M, right? And that gets pretty small. It also does something weird like with the line height and stuff, right? And so what I can also do is, actually, let's go ahead and address the line height. So I think that the line height, the spacing's a little bit too big. So let's do like 1.15M for the line height and see how it pulled it a little bit closer together. I think that that's a little bit better. Now, where it says font size though, I want to show you some other alternative way of doing font size, and that's using a different unit of measure called viewport width. So if I did something like, let's say 10 VW, then what that means is that it's going to scale based on the dimension of the viewport. So if I take this back out of the iPhone 5 SE and just do responsive, then what you see what it means is that it actually is going to scale the text with the size of the browser. And then I want you to notice something else too, so that we can see how the media query works. Look up here. This is the width right here. So right now it's at 457. As I scale larger, larger, all right, you'll start to see, and then boom, I hit 700 and it changes because it's no longer reading this media query rule any longer. Okay, and so that's something to consider, right? And most likely, you know, you can think about actual sizes, like, so you could look at like an iPad, for instance, and if you wanted to check out an iPad, you can see here that the dimensions are 768 by 1024. You can also do a rotation for the device and see how it would look that way. Okay, so that's kind of a nice feature. And let's go back to that iPhone 5 SE. And I think that that is actually okay. And then I think actually maybe it could be a little bit smaller. So instead of 10 VW, I don't like the way that the letter A is coming down by itself. Let's change it. Let's go down to like 9. Still doing that. Let's go down to 8. And then I think it does a better grouping of the text right here. And so I think that I'm okay with this being my size. So in this case, anything lower than 700 pixels will get a viewport width. Now the reason I don't like to go and use viewport width for really large screens is because whenever you're on a larger screen dimension, the actual distance that you are from the screen doesn't necessarily change just because you're on a larger screen. So something that's 27 inches wide, like an iMac, you know, a big iMac, you're still probably going to have the same viewing distance as you would on a smaller 20-inch monitor, right? And you might even have the same viewing distance as you would for a laptop. And if that's the case, then you don't want your text to get too big. And so I don't like to use viewport width whenever it gets to be really big, or if I do use viewport width, I want it to you know, work with a media query so that it'll max out and stop getting too big, because otherwise the text can get too big in a way that you're going to have to sort of like sit back to read it, and you don't want that to happen. So all right, so we've got this H1, right? We've restyled that, and if we scroll down, you'll see these margins are a little bit too big, right? We've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's on the low end of readability for good reading, all right? And so what you can do instead is, if we were to look over here, if you remember our section and our footer, those are the two rules where we set the width to 80% and we have a max width of 800. So this is something else we'd want to stick inside of our media query. And you need to make sure that you're being careful where you type these media queries or these rules. Make sure that you don't type it on the outside of this last curly brace. This last curly brace is closing. Oops, I did not mean to do that. This last curly brace closes the opening curly brace for the whole media query. And don't forget that inside you've got full CSS rules that have their own opening and closing curly braces as well. So let's go down here and we're going to type, let's do section. And I'm going to put a comment and I'm going to group this rule and do footer. And the reason is because the things that we want to change are common to both of them. So what we had before was we had a width of 80%. So let's change that so that we've got like 90% and see what happens there. And I think that that might actually be a lot more readable. It might be a little bit easier. In fact, you could even go a little bit more than that. So you could say like maybe 93% and see what happens. And I think that that works too. I don't want to go too far to the edge because I still want a little bit of space, but that does help with the number of words per line. I could see what line 95 looks like. 95 is okay up here, but then down in this footer, Actually, I don't think that it works so much for the footer. I think that that should be a little bit different. And so in that case, maybe I don't want to group this footer. Let's do this, like where we say that the footer is a little bit different. So let's open this up and we'll say that the width for the footer is instead 90%, and it's a little bit smaller than the width of the section. And yeah, and we don't have to really worry about a max width. If you remember, because this max width is 800 pixels and our media query maxes out at 700, so we don't really have to worry about that. Now that looks good. The only thing is that now we've got this ton of extra padding down here for the article, which we probably don't need any longer. And some of that is going to really depend a little bit on what else is happening, right? And so before I do anything, let's go ahead and let's copy this whole media query. I'm going to copy that into my clipboard. And I'm going to go into my CSS over here and I'm going to paste it. And you can't just put it anywhere. You actually need to put it down at the very end because it's going to override the preceding rules and and make it work that way. So now I can close this, and actually let's go ahead and save all. And I can close this and now I can hit refresh and everything looks okay, right? And then if we start to scroll, or not scroll, but if we start to make this smaller, here, let's do this, you'll see somewhere in here it's going to kick in, and you see that it kicked in because now the text is actually scaling, right? So that media query kicked in. You can scroll down. This is now 95%, where the footer is now 90%, and still looks pretty good. I think it's still actually fine. And then if you wanted to double check, it looked like we had some padding issue, but we can go back and double check here. And it looks okay. So sometimes whenever you do something and you change something in a media query, sometimes you actually need to go back to the file, save it, and then update it, and you can see now that the padding is okay. If we open this up a little bit, I can also rotate it and see what it would look like whenever it's like that, when the phone would be in that. And so that's not bad. That still works okay. If you wanted, you could also go back and change this contribute so that's a little smaller if that seems to be bothering you. You can look at the Pixel 2, we can rotate it, see if that looks okay. And that actually doesn't look very good. And that's at 731 pixels. So maybe what we really need to do then is maybe we need to go down to this media query. Let's find our media query and let's change that from 700 to like maybe 740 and see, and you can see it automatically updated it, and so we're okay. And I think 740 might be a good place for us in terms of our media query. And you can write more than one media query. You can just write them until things break, right? I mean, that's the whole idea. So anyway, that does conclude it. I wanted to introduce the concept of media queries because we're going to be using them later, and that is the basis of, or at least a big component of responsive design.